just sort of soft talking is.
Yeah, I quite like that though. That's quite nice. It's more human, and as you say, it's supposed to be chatting. So
this is it.
That's good.
Yeah. And also, I don't know how well it works in audio, but people don't seem to moan too much. Everyone, welcome to RailNat, and we're here. Hello. Hello. Dr Mike Esbester's here.
Uh-oh.
Yes, hello, Mike. I can hear you. It's fine. You're here. In fact, I can do this to prove you're here. Hello, we're waving. We're both here. Hello. You can talk. I said welcome to RailNat, but it's not the opening credits yet, so we're fine.
Phew.
I know you're worrying. One thing I need to apologise for to everyone watching. NDI, which is the thing that I connect up our esteemed guests into RailNatter, does a bit of a desync with voice and picture. So when you talk, your mouth, you look a little bit like you're from a 1970s kung fu movie. It's a little bit, but it's fine. That's my tech problems. Can everyone hear? Yeah, I know, right? Can everyone hear the sound balance is good? Good. Everyone's happy. I can see people giving me thumbs up, so that's grand. That's exactly what I need to hear. Right. Well, without further ado, I'm going to crack on. Before Mike has a chance to introduce himself, and before we continue, let's do the news. Everyone's here. Yes, Big Face confirmed. We've on Big Face. Now we're going to do the news. So, budget goodies for rail. Nope, no, there aren't any. Absolute blank slate. Nothing at all. So let's just move on from that, frankly. Nothing at all in the budget. Chance to rebuild, not taken, yada yada. Which incidentally leads us nicely into this Institute for Government paper about the fact that the UK is just very bad at transport policy. It's a very good paper, and I'm currently chatting to both Alistair Baldwin and Kelly Shuttleworth from the Institute for Government to join RailNatter for the first official two-guest version of RailNatter. I'm going to have to work out the technology to make this happen. I haven't yet. But anyway, that should be happening soon, which will be exciting because it's a really strong paper on everything that Britain gets wrong in terms of transport policy, and it's fascinating, and it compares different countries. Really, really worthwhile read. I'd heartily recommend it. Anyway, so we'll page flick through that at some point in the future in another episode. Oh yes, this picture. I didn't show you this picture, everyone, so don't tell anyone about it. But this picture is of this is all the various options that have been announced for, or that were in the works for what everyone stupidly calls Northern Powerhouse Rail. But actually, so this is kind of like, this is green on. Ella's going to shout at me so much. Ella, don't shout at me. I'm going to, for the colourblind people, I'm going to put yellow. That's better. NPR. So this is NPR here. Actually, better called, so NPR, but I prefer HS3. Some people call it High Speed North. It's got a load of names. In any case, the orange line here is actually my proposed alignment for a long time ago, so don't worry too much about that. But the grey lines here are all of the different lines that are being assessed as part of Transport for the North's Northern Powerhouse Rail. And I think the chosen route is going to be this one that comes in, so it's got its own dedicated new route into Liverpool, into Lime Street here. Then it's going to go through, and I think it'll have an interchange with Bank Quay in Warrington here, which means it'll be taking this route through. Then it'll do its thing up the High Speed 2 connection into Piccadilly. I think it'll do this weird shenanigans here, and it'll come up. And I think the route they're going to take is, which one was? I think it, unless they either have a back in, I think they're probably going to take this route over the Pennines. I think this might have changed slightly to make the railway a bit closer to Bradford. So this might be a bit more like this now. In any case, the route will probably then continue on into Leeds, and then there'll be a bit of I think there'll then be a kind of a connection up here between the existing kind of Leeds to York line to allow a bypassing of Garforth and then straight onto HS2 and then whizzing up here. So I think that is what the final proposed Northern Powerhouse Rail route will be. So as I said, none of you know about this. I have not put this slide up. None of you can see this. Next. Right, onto something a bit more somber, which I think is relevant, particularly relevant for the discussion we're going to have today, actually. And I'm sure it'll be a kind of a jovial chat when we get to it, but I thought it'd be important to just put it in context of why this is important from a contemporary perspective. And frankly, it's the fact that the railway is still not safe enough for its staff. It still isn't. Tyler Byrne was very sadly killed at Surbiton Station, he was hit by a train. During his work, and it's just not good enough. It's the 21st century. We should not be killing or injuring our staff. It's just not good enough. And it has, and actually, I think if I skip to the next slide, this slide here it shows fatalities in pink, and then potentially not necessarily a more important, but certainly an equally as important measure, which is fatalities and weighted injuries. Maybe we'll get to chatting about this later, Mike. But so fatalities and weighted injuries take fatalities and major and minor injuries and shock and trauma, and combine them into one figure. So so the equivalent of a fatality, a major injury is a tenth of a fatality, and a minor injury or shock and trauma is 1,000th, or a whatever the one, like, or a kind of a 500th of a fatality.
Proportion.
And it allows them all to. It basically allows us to understand the way that they all the kind of not just so something that causes one fatality every 100 years is perhaps not as significant as something that causes 10,000 minor injuries every year. So it allows us to have a bit of a balance of understanding risk. So anyway, so this is the measure of staff injuries and fatalities since 2002, 2003. I don't know if have you seen this, Mike? Have you seen this kind of represented like this?
Well, so I had, the FWI, yes. Although I'd never been able to put forward a kind of cogent explanation as you just did. So well done. I mean, it makes perfect sense, and we might, as you say, talk a little bit about some of the earlier stats for the particular 20th century, where we don't have that information. Certainly not portrayed in that way. So we've got kind of absolute numbers and some that are slightly more useful. But that is extremely useful to see, because for the trends, it flags up.
And you can see that actually there's no. It'd be nice to have this data for over longer, which again we'll talk about later. But certainly in terms of recent years, there is no rapid descent. There's no descending trend. Particularly, you can see overall the FWI are steadily decreasing, but not quickly. And in terms of fatalities, there's not a particularly stable trend. We have a number of fatalities. 2014-15 was a really bad year for safety on the working railway. So overall, railways are still not safe enough for staff. And this is kind of, I think, I'm looking forward. I've been looking forward to this chat since really we kind of actually Dr. David Turner and I thought that it should happen, and then we had an email chat, and I'm glad that we're having this, because I think it's going to be a mixture of thinking about the history, but also the contemporary context and kind of what we can learn and So I think it's going to be an interesting one. Yes. So from that slightly somber note, we shall have an interesting chat from here on in. But without further ado, it only really remains for me to start the show. Welcome to tonight's Rail Natter, everyone. It's going to be a good one. Here we go. And the lovely Intercity 225 fades away. We can come back to. I'm very pleased to be able to, so we can get our guest faces up here, Mike. Right. And there, in fact, we start with an image of fairly horrifying-looking rail crash, actually. But before we talk about that, let's Mike, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are.
Thanks, Gareth, and thanks very much for having me on and for everyone being here. I've been looking forward to this for some time. So I am an academic historian. Like David Turner, who's a friend of mine as well. I went through the course at York, at the university there, and with the Railway Museum. So it's kind of strong background there. I'm now based down at the University of Portsmouth, where I don't do masses of transport history, although I do some. I sneak it in amongst my other teaching responsibilities and so on. Yeah,
I realised only too late that I was like, oh, I've not got a witty way to describe Dr. Mike Esbester's career and sort of what he does. So I stuck historian of transport / employment in there. That might be like not entirely the perfect description, but hopefully it kind of broadly covers you.
I think, yeah, for the purposes of tonight, it definitely does. Because I'm pushing the two together. So I started off as a historian of transport, and then got interested in the staff safety side of things. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on, because there's one slide in particular that really kind of flags that up. And yeah, I've been lucky enough to carry on in my professional life, being able to spend at least some time looking and thinking a bit about the history of safety, history of transport, history of mobility, all sorts of things, and doing some teaching, some research, fairly kind of standard academic stuff, I think, in that sense. For my sins, I'm on the editorial board of the Journal of Transport History as well, which is always quite fun.
Yeah.
And I am currently co-leading the Railway Work, Life and Death project, about which I'll say something later, all being well. So
Thanks. That's a good summary. So it hopefully gives people an idea. I think a lot of people in here will be familiar with, if not knowing you, then they'll be familiar with the Twitter feed of the Railway Work, Life and Death project, which is it's an eternal source of kind of interesting information, tidbits, and mildly horrifying images of trepidatious working habits.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And the nice thing, and I should say about this, is kind of give a non-trigger warning at the beginning. One of the things that we're quite clear on in the project side of things is that the images we're using, they're all posed images that were produced originally for accident prevention purposes, or they are kind of press photography, photographs that are in the public domain. No bodies, nothing that could be, I think, distasteful. In that sense, so
it's a very
again, we went through that.
That's a very good point, and I'm really bad at remembering to do proper content warnings. But we are going to discuss matters of sort of safety, life and death. There's not going to be anything gory, but we're going to discuss things that might be kind of quite unpleasant for people who've perhaps been exposed to some of these situations. If anyone's watching, who's kind of fair warning on that. I don't think there's going to be anything particularly unpleasant, but just a bit of a content warning there. So let's miniaturize our faces. And bring the front of the Daily Mirror from 1921 back.
Yes, absolutely.
Mike, tell us about this image, and here we go.
Well, I was going to start off by kind of giving some context and mentioning Tyler Byrne because it's relevant. He's relevant here, and the other recent fatalities and injuries that we hear less about are relevant because for exactly the reasons you mentioned in the preamble. We need to think about these issues. The railway is not a safe place. Now, the story that we might uncover this evening, the chat we'll have, might show some improvement. There has been improvement, undoubtedly, but one fatality is still one too many. So it's kind of that sort of context really important. I wanted to start us off thinking about passenger safety, ironically, when I'm kind of more interested in staff safety on those grounds. So yeah, Abermule, we had the centenary earlier this year, big front page news at the time, understandably so, head-on collision, how many dead, 17 killed, I think. It was undoubtedly terrible stuff. And I wanted to kind of get a front page shot of it to give us that impression that this is stuff that does make the public news, the public eye. And that's useful for us in all sorts of ways. At the same time, it's not the complete story. And lots of people get missed out. And by and large, that's the staff, both in the past. Perhaps nowadays, it's less of the case, certainly when it comes to fatalities, because they are so relatively rare. We do see them in the press and hear about them in the news. At the 1921, that was definitely not the case. And in fact, for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, that was not the case, simply because so many members of staff were being killed or injured at work.
Yeah. We've already so we are one feature of Rail Natter, as you know, is that we do get many questions coming through. Some of them, what I'll do is I'll queue them up towards the end, I think. So Matt Reed, your question about green and red zone working, we'll kind of queue that up to the end, because I think we'll kind of discuss some of the more contemporary stuff and maybe a bit later on. But good question. Remind me later on, Matt. Anyway, sorry, Mike. So prod me whenever you want me to change slides. I'm the good graduate at the back of the room with the slide machine, and I slot the next one in.
Excellent stuff. Yeah, we'll do. So again, all I was going to say on this, in previous Rail Natters, I know you had Melanie Osborne on talking about signalling and why trains generally don't meet each other coming, which is of course incredibly important, and that's really helpful. And I should say that for the passenger side of things, if we're looking back to the past, well, actually right up to the present, Gary Keener and the Railways Archive website is a fantastic resource for the passenger side. And I should say thanks to Gary, because when I was getting started off with the looking at the staff accident side of things, I had a chat with him. He's really helpful about it. But what's really interesting, and again, this kind of goes on to the staff aren't really known about in the past, at least. I said to him, you've got all the passenger, or you're working on the passenger reports with help from the ORR, which is great. But what about the worker reports? Similar sorts of things, but for workers, no, there weren't any. Yeah. Well, no, actually, there were. It's just that no one knows about them, and it'd be really great to find a way to bring that to public attention and to make people more aware of what was going on. For various reasons, in the project and a lot of my own research, we're covering the period up to the Second World War. The problems again with issues in terms of data protection and people who were injured but still living after that. And even when we get to 1939, it's still just possible that there are some living people who might be named in the material. So we've got to be quite careful about that for understandable reasons.
Yep.
So yeah, it's going to be interesting. This kind of contrast between the public visibility of the passenger side and I think the relative invisibility of the workers' side of things. Absolutely. So,
you and me both when it comes to on the Railways Archive. Yeah, I also relied heavily on the Railways Archive as part of my master's thesis on, which is it's an incredible resource. So yeah, definitely agree on a shout out for that. But given the scale of resource that is, the fact that it was devoid of these reports into staff incidents is incredible. It makes that point very crisply, how little regard there is for collecting that, or until recently, how little regard there was for collecting that data.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible kind of thinking about it. For 1921, I pulled up the stats on it, and in that year there were 93 passenger deaths and just under 2,600 passenger injuries. On the workforce side of things, there were 262 deaths and just a bit over 16,000 injuries. The scale of difference is quite immense. For every passenger that's killed or injured, you've got 6 workers being killed or injured. So it's an immense number, and again, cumulatively, it adds up over the years. Really quite dramatically and quite depressingly, frankly. Yeah. It's so little change for such a long time. So, yeah, I think kind of one of the things that I'm particularly interested in then is trying to put the workers back into this equation and see about getting the word out about them. So if we skip on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, sure. I tell you what, I'm gonna hide our faces. We can still chat, but while our faces are gone, it means that we can see all these postcards in full.
Great stuff. Yeah, thank you. So I don't know whether anyone's run across these sorts of things before. Disaster postcards, and this is one of the things where kind of research takes in really unexpected directions. I'm interested in railway safety and railway worker safety in particular, but I'm also interested in ideas about safety, accidents, risk in the past in general, because I think it's a really interesting way of kind of looking at what society deems to be important or not important. Accidents generally are things that get overlooked. They just happen, which is, well, I'm sure we'll discuss, quite a duff sort of an attitude.
Yeah.
But for much of the past, that really was the way these things have been regarded. So when you combine that then with the craze in the early 20th century for sending postcards, people have kind of likened it to the email of the day. With several postal deliveries in any given day, millions of these things were being sent. And it was perhaps unsurprising then that some enterprising people, and all of these were produced by one postcard producer, Warner Goddard of Barnsley, they were out photographing disastrous things, sticking them on postcards, and people were, selling them, and then people were sending them. So I think one of the things, well, it is really, and you think a bit about questions of taste and so on. Again, just getting to this idea that the past is quite different. I'm not sure. Would people do this now? It's hard to say. What I find quite interesting about the Gothard postcards like these is that generally they manage to ferret out portraits, taken in life of the people involved. So this is quite a nice reminder in this sense. These are all passenger crashes, with a possible exception of, I'm just trying to think, the Sharnbrook one. So top
the
right.
one might be it's an express goods so that's two goods ones, but the others are all passenger ones,
Yeah. So again, it's kind of interesting in that one. And I should say about the Sharnbrook one, which is nice. Of the two that was staff pictured, the fireman John Hawley, I had an email about 2 weeks ago because we put up a blog post about the case when it came to the anniversary, so early Feb, and a day or two after that, I had an email from someone saying, "Oh, I'm his great niece, and I'll dig around and see what we got in the family kind of records and whatnot to see about the kind of the impact that the crash had on the family," which I think is really interesting, kind of getting to the personal side of things.
Yeah.
And even more kind of small worldish. It turned out that the husband of the lady who got in touch used to work in history at Portsmouth.
Wow.
So it's kind of small. One of my former colleagues was a colleague of his at the time. So it's one of those funny things.
Yeah.
These postcards are really nice in that sense of we actually get to see some of the people involved.
It's incredible how quickly they pulled these together. Given getting the portraits, throwing the graphics together. It's quite a remarkable miniature industry.
Well, it really is. This is something that I'm desperate to do a bit more work on, as all academics are. Oh, this is really interesting. I'll do something on it. Just don't have time at the moment. I've got another postcard of it's First World War it's a factory explosion, a munitions factory explosion that happened early in the First World War, and the little text on it that accompanies it, because you see each of them have a little description about what's happened and the people involved and so on. It says, this morning. This factory blew up, and this afternoon we got these postcards and put these images and put this postcard together. You think that's incredible. Yeah. It was on the opposite side of the country to where to where Gothard was based. How's he got this information and got it all together and is producing postcards?
David Shepherd asks, was this a postcard company working as a pressure group for safety, or were they just like tabloid journalists? My fear is that this was the latter. This was just a profiteering exercise, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, what's really quite interesting is that for one case a little bit earlier, not with this company, but one particularly bad case on the Great Eastern Railway, the crash at Wytham, I'm not sure, on the Kramer. Whittam, right? Okay, there we go. The one I didn't go for. Brilliant. There's the railway company bans the sale of these postcards on the station because people going to that station and seeing, buy this nice postcard of the crash at this station last week.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, if nothing else, it's not good for sales, is it?
No, indeed, and I think you're right. It is about profit because they not just Gothard. I mean, loads and loads of these. Lots were produced. Sometimes I think as well people would take photographs and the technology then existed to be able to turn them very quickly into postcards. So I've got a number. Again, this is one of the occupational hazards, this sort of thing. You turn into a bit of a collector. So I try and pick these things up as I go. It's clear that people are producing these effectively kind of in short runs of one or two even. Slapping a message on the back and sending it off to the friend. What's quite interesting then is exactly that. Is then sometimes the messages you get on the back of these are absolutely fascinating. I've picked up a few that talk directly about the accident. Some people say, "Oh, I went to see it," like a kind of a great spectacle to go and see. Some people say they put a cross by the person, say, "Oh, this is Dad. He's helping get clear the wreckage." And then other people, kind of complete contrast to that. There's you kind of think a bit questionable messages in some respects, in the sense of sent clearly from the seaside saying, having a lovely holiday, the weather's nice, see you soon, wish you were here.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you've got this image of death and destruction, effectively.
That's incredible.
It's again a really interesting kind of way of looking at how people understood accidents in all sorts of fields at the time, and how much attention or not they paid to them.
Yeah, it's interesting what was normalised at the time. For someone to have that scale of destruction and just sort of just be totally disengaged from it, and
completely,
absolutely fascinating.
So this was a little way by kind of virtue of trying to put some of the staff back in and showing some of the people involved, so we get some sense. Because again, I think it's important that we do look at the individuals in this. If we shuffle on to the next slide.
Yeah, so I shall do this, and then I shall bring our faces back as well. Here we are, we're back.
Fabulous. So this one, I'm probably not going to say all that much about that, because I suspect I'm preaching to the converted on this one. But what I wanted to do was get a tiny capture. All these images come from the National Railway Museum, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, has a wonderful photographic collection. And I wanted to give an impression of the variety of work that the railways encompassed for the 19th and much of the 20th centuries. We probably, we have in our mind's eye, I think, the trains themselves and the crews and so on. If we maybe think about the goods trains as well, then might think about the guards on those and station staff. But that's a tiny fraction of what the railways were doing, of course. So the workshops, great example, all that unguarded machinery, the belts and so on, which, as you can imagine, perfect, was less than ideal. But also, the interest in shipping, in docks, the hotel side of things, the road side of things. So horse and cart to start with, later motorised. Eventually, in the 1930s, they start to get interested in aviation as well. So the railways are really interesting in the sense that they've got such a diverse workforce in terms of the roles that they're undertaking, that I wanted just to remind us of that and say, well, look, there's a lot going on. I also wanted to include the photo top right, which is in some ways misleading, but from the First World War and showing women cleaners at work. And I say misleading, this was new for the First World War, but women worked on the railways from the outset, albeit in different roles, often as things like crossing keepers and so on. So just a reminder that there are plenty of women both working on the railways. I mean, a small proportion, admittedly, but in all sorts of different roles as well, albeit quite traditional roles in terms of the gender stereotypes of the time.
Yeah, it wasn't. It didn't start with the PR bang that was happening. With the First World War, it was sort of, as you say, right from the start. A few people pointing out some very interesting things in relation to the postcards, actually. Maybe we'll pick some of this up later, but I just want to mention it in case I forget. Firstly, Matt Reed, yes, the NRM photo collection is accessible online. First thing to say. Yeah. Second thing, Owen O'Neill, just as normalised as we are today to the drip of deaths on the road. Well, that's a very good point. And maybe that's something we can maybe touch on later, but just in case I forget, I think Mike and I probably both concur on that one. Yeah, that's a good analogy, I suppose.
Absolutely.
To the nearly 2,000 people who die on the roads every year in Britain. So right. I'm going to audio describe. I've been forgetting to do my audio description. So we've already talked about one of the pictures here, which is three women with their hair up, polishing a shiny looking loco, which is very nice. The next image is next up we've got a nice dock image with lots of people in flat caps, it's kind of putting things in.
Sorry to jump into it. It's Garston Docks over Liverpool, and 1913. They're unloading bananas, I believe.
Oh, really? Ah, nice. Okay, yeah. So, that's good. So they're unloading bananas, which is nice. There's another one here, which is of what's this called? What's the process called? Well, basically, they've got a load of bars, and what's the process when you're using rods to basically divert and push trucks along, which is scarily frightening.
Yeah, absolutely. So this one is it's tow roping. There's a rope stretched between the tender of the engine and the wagon. As you can see, it's set to move off down the other line.
Yep. I see. So it's essentially it's towing it in. Okay. So that's so that the loco doesn't get locked in next to the buffer, is it? Something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then you've already talked about the machine, the kind of the workshop, the machining kind of going on in the bottom right photo there, with all sorts of bits of equipment and all sorts going on, and people with just huge numbers of kind of unprotected wheels and conveyor belts and kind of drive belts and everything hanging all over the place. Does not look like a nice place to trap fingers, frankly.
No, exactly. Generally, a kind of a nasty sort of thing to get caught up in.
Yeah. So yeah, fantastic. So right, shall we go to the next one? Yeah.
Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So we have a graph. So first of all, let's describe the trend we see, and then you can talk. We can talk about it. So there's a graph on here, and it's total railway employee casualties from 1900 to 1938. And there's a big surge in what appears to be the First World War years.
It's just before.
It's just before, actually. It's just pre-14. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's a gap in the First World War. So there's the just up in the run up to the First World War. There's a great surge in the number of employee casualties. Okay, yeah, tell us about this.
So, well, it's in some respects it's a bit misleading, and for some of the reasons you've already touched on with the weighted idea. These are absolute numbers, so they tell us numbers of people who were killed or injured, and the majority would have been injuries. What it doesn't tell us, obviously, is the proportions in terms of numbers of people employed and so on. So, the last the bit where we hit the gap, just before we hit the gap, the big spike is 1913, and then we've got just under 30,000 employees either injured or killed. It's about 485, from memory, deaths, and the rest are injuries. So that's that is a massive number of people. There are about, at that point, it's just under 650,000 people employed. So even so, I meant to do the maths on this. I'm sorry, I can't do maths on the fly. I'm terrible about the proportions here. But it's not great, unfortunately. And then we got the gap in the middle of the First World War, where the obviously accidents are still happening, but the statistics are rubbish. They stopped collecting the statistics because of wartime pressures and so on. So we've got this annoying gap where we don't know much about what's going on in any detail. And then generally, down there, we're kind of heading downwards, broadly speaking, in terms of numbers of people being injured or killed. It's a bit misleading, again, for a couple of reasons, which I should say. This doesn't include any workshop staff. So if you worked in a railway factory, Doncaster, Crewe, Swindon, wherever, you're not included in these numbers. And there are various, I won't go into it, there are various tedious logistic reasons behind it, which to do with the way that the government collected the stats. And the big spikes that we get there's one that happens around 1907, the kind of sudden upward trend is, I think, quite interesting in some respects. It's not a real increase. What it reflects is a change in the way that the accidents are recorded. So there, I think they move from accidents only being reportable if you are off work for, now I'm going to get this wrong, I think it's down from 3 days to 1 day. So what we should be seeing before that is similar sorts of levels to that. That's kind of peak in 1907.
Okay, so almost to this, is that the extent to which a statistical change, and this is just, and this period here is really the change in the collection. Is that sort of what you're saying? Interesting. Exactly. Okay, perfect.
So what I think we're seeing, and again, what we don't know is the number of people who might be injured at work, perhaps in a minor way, and not report it, and therefore not be off work and so on, because they need the money, they need to keep working, they don't want to be seen as being awkward, or what have you. So statistics, numbers only capture something in any given time, and this is one of those times when we need to be quite careful about them. But I wanted to show them to kind of give some trend based on the absolute numbers, and hopefully people are quite horrified by that, and to give some sense of there is some very broad movement downwards, which again we see over the 20th century, and we might come on to say a little bit more about that, I suppose. Actually, well, now would probably be a good time. So having said that, so a lot of my work is really concentrated on the period up to the Second World War. So whilst I've done a bit on the post-Second World War period, it's perhaps less so. So I haven't got a nice-ish graph like this to show it visually, but we're still looking at 1950. We've got just over 200 workers being killed, and around 18,000 injured in a single year. So we're still looking at really high numbers, albeit down from this sort of level. we then we start seeing a drop off in the 1960s and the 1970s for, again, both in absolute numbers, which partly reflects the declining numbers of staff employed, but also in kind of relative terms as well. So the proportions do start to get better, which is not to say they're great. Now this is the bit where I haven't got the good comparative stats to show what sort of proportions we're looking at, but I know the one that I could dig out easily was that for 1959, there was one PW or S&T fatality for every 1,000 staff.
Yeah.
Which is, is again mind-bogglingly sad and high on that front. But yeah, then we get down towards into the 70s, into the 80s, and things are definitely getting better. They are not perfect, but they are definitely getting better. I think one of the key things I wanted people to think about from this is that, again, about the high numbers. The problem is that I think it's a apocryphal quote from Stalin, isn't it? That 1 million deaths is a statistic, 1 death is a tragedy.
Yes.
Again, how true that is or not, I don't know whether it's really something he said, but I think that's the case here. That each one of these people was an individual, and they had friends, they had family, they lived and worked in communities, and when something bad happened to them, death or injury, it had much wider impacts, and it's difficult, I think, with the numbers game to recognise that.
Yeah, particularly during this period. Okay, in some cases, the railway companies provided for their family, their next of kin, their dependents, but during this period, I dare say a lot of the people who lost people who they were depending on for income there's a much higher risk that they ended up in destitution.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The 19th century, I'm glad, because I wasn't quite sure how to I haven't got a nice kind of picture of this or something to show about, but I'm glad you mention it, because 19th century, there's not, until 1897, there's no automatic compensation for railway staff or their dependents if something goes wrong. So they're kind of basically there on a wing and a prayer and on the goodwill of the company. So sometimes the companies would re-employ staff, albeit in lesser roles. Or sometimes they might provide a small payment, typically funeral costs, in the event of a fatality. But you do see, and it's really sad to see in the files at Kew at the National Archives, the letters of supplication coming to the management board saying, my husband lost a leg or my husband was killed at work. We need some money. Can you do anything? And they do it as a one-off gratuity, but no legal obligation. Things changed a bit after 1897 when there is automatic compensation introduced. So there's effectively a kind of menu of compensation. You're looking at about £300 for a fatality, and small amounts thereafter, depending on the seriousness of the injury and the lasting nature of the injury. So it's not great by any stretch of the imagination. And again, particularly in the period before 1908, 1911, when you start to get things like old age pensions and a little bit of social security. Before that, there isn't a safety net in that way. Yeah. So this could have really quite catastrophic effects on that.
Gareth Williams asks what injured means. Well, we've kind of alluded to the fact that it kind of changed, that meaning changes actually. So you've alluded to the fact that it sounds like this trend is related to days off work. So that's a way of measuring if someone is injured, if they've been off work for a certain number of days. Yeah,
that's it. I don't know quite when this changed, but certainly for much of the period that I'm familiar with, that was exactly it's how long I've worked for. What I should have said, of course, is that none of this includes health impacts either, which could have been a bit. Again, health is always a tricky thing to find out about historically, because there's so many different, it's long term, so many different factors that may play a part in it, and so on. So it's a challenge. There should be some interesting work coming out of the project that we're doing with the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick, which holds the trades union records. Now, the NUR RMT, as it is now, have some really interesting records that do touch on health. So we're bringing them into the project work. So hopefully, at some point in the future, we'll have more to say about that. But at the moment, yes. And this doesn't include shock in the way that we understand it now. These are effectively bodily injuries that count in inverted commas. So basically, kind of, if it's visible, it counts.
Yeah. So that definition really changes through time. Shall I push it?
Please.
Time is flying. It's amazing how time flies on these. It's incredible. So
again, this was a really quick one. It was more in the vein of showing people some of the faces again of the workers. These are all killed at work on the Great Eastern Railway, featured in the company Staff magazine. Staff magazines are brilliant things for research and finding out about what was going on and so on. So each little extract gives us a little teeny tiny bit of information about the individual concerned, but it is a small. It's not even the tip of the iceberg. It's such a small representation, but again, I think is really helpful and important to do it. So that was all I was going to say about that.
And you can see the range of there's a range of ages there, and in some cases it looks like a range of kind of employment seniorities as well. So it just shows what the wide range of people impacted by. I dare say primarily the people impacted would have been those at the lower end of the pay scale, because they're the ones often doing the heavier labour. But these images show a kind of a wider range of people actually than I perhaps expected.
Yeah, I mean, again, it just goes to reflect that the breadth of roles on the railways at this time. And yes, absolutely, this idea about the ages of people covered as well comes into play. And again, maybe something we talk about later if there's time.
Yeah, sure. So I shall press this button. Oh, right, here we go, yeah.
Right.
Actually, there's a lot of pixels, so what I might quickly do is shrink this down a bit, so it's actually probably make the image a bit clearer. There we are.
Yeah. Perfect, yeah, that's great, thank you. So this one, obviously dangerous. Well, of course, how wonderful. I had to include this one. This is really one of the things that got me started on this. So I was doing some research on something entirely unrelated, albeit railway, but not related to safety and accidents. And I came across this. This was featured in a booklet from 1932, and I thought, well, thanks management, because it's a management-produced booklet. I'm sure the workers probably knew that this was obviously dangerous. What a cheek to tell them that, and particularly when the people who are producing this sort of material, do not have that practical day-to-day experience of being out, and certainly not doing the heavy manual work that quite a lot of the accident prevention advice was aimed at. Yeah. And I've done quite light touch on the accident prevention images tonight. I think this might be the only one that I'd asked.
I think it is, but there's a plethora on the Twitter feed. It's probably the best place to go, I'd say, to get the images.
Exactly. I was going to say, basically, there's a whole other story about the accident prevention side of things, which I think is fascinating. And if time allows in the future, I'd gladly come back to talk more, because again, it's really interesting how it kind of starts and then translates and carries on to the present day in some ways. But yes, I like this one for that reason. And I one of the things we don't have much about is how staff responded to images like this. My initial response is I'd chuck that in a bin, frankly, because obviously.
So to describe this image, we have, because conscious for our audio only people, this is a crossover, two tracks paralleling each other with a track kind of diagonally connecting the two. There's a person, could be a ganger, could be whoever it happens to be, facing in the direction that traffic is going, kind of with their back to traffic, if you like. And indeed, there is a locomotive with a train not very far behind them, in a staged image, but this person is very decidedly not noticed the train. And the caption here is obviously dangerous, full stop, which... I suppose it is. Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah. So thanks. Yeah, that is important, and I still can't. I look at this every time and just think, really, come on, we could we have done better than this in 1932? I don't know. But it's interesting, I think, for what it tells us about the way that the management are viewing the staff as well. On that, as I say, that's.
The thing is, I suppose what this image, and when I first saw this image, it got me thinking the same thing. If you look through some of the literature now, you'll find images that are this sort of stupidly obvious, and they're almost kind of making a point of, like, this is obviously stupid, but actually, you could find yourself in this situation if you just step back with And so I suppose potentially that was the point being made with this image then. I don't know. I don't know the context of the image, but potentially it was part of a wider, like, this is obviously dangerous, but have a think about how you could find yourself in that situation in your duties. So yeah, I find this one particularly interesting because I think there's a bit on, given the context of, I suppose what it gets me thinking is what images that talk about railway safety now. If I grab my guide to personal track safety that I have here from the last time I did my PTS, what images are there in here that look stupid if you take them out of context? Probably a fair few. So so it's kind of interesting to sort of think about that. What images will your predecessors, no, the other way around, and no, yeah, what people who are taking on your project, the RWLD project in 100 years, what pictures are they going to be laughing at that Network Rail put out?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's a nice link back to the present, because that's one of the things where I think that this sort of material is really, really interesting and really important, that there's a bit of thinking about it and how it's used, partly because of its history, because it's quite loaded. But anyway, that's, as I say, that's one for another time.
Yeah.
Perhaps. So yeah, if we shuffle on to the next slide.
Definitely, yeah. So, right, good.
Ta-da! Project.
Ta-da.
So this really is. Again, I'm just going to say a tiny bit about this because I'm conscious of time, but we are a collaboration between my institution, the University of Portsmouth, the National Railway Museum, the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick, who have the trade union records, and we're being assisted by the National Archives, who have the railway company records. So we're putting together what will eventually be a data set. We're thinking perhaps around 80,000 cases of staff accidents covering what was the UK from, it looks like the 1860s. We found some very earlier records than we thought we had, through to 1939. I say what was the UK because obviously that included Ireland up to 1921 and then Northern Ireland thereafter. So we've got some Irish cases in the data that's publicly available at the moment, which is about 6,500 cases. So it's kind of a tiny fraction of what we will have available at some point. But we've got wonderful teams of willing volunteers, and a huge thanks to all of them, based at the National Railway Museum, at the Modern Record Centre and the National Archives, who are sifting through various records. So state records, so state accident investigators, the Railway Inspectorate, so their worker accident reports. The trade union produced materials, so that's for the NUR and the ASRS, its predecessor union, and for the railway companies themselves. So we kind of get this triangulation of different official railway industry sources describing accidents to workers. And what we realised about is looking at this, there's masses of data, masses of cases, and people don't know it's there, and they don't know that the potential value of it for all sorts of people, whether that's within the current industry, whether that's family historians, whether it's academics, all sorts, enthusiasts, what have you, because it tells us all sorts of really interesting things, not just about who was involved, but obviously about what was happening, the working practices, then in some cases what steps were then taken to try and prevent similar things happening again. So again, there's an awful lot that will come out of this, and I think what's great about it is that it can reflect what people come to it with. So if you've got a particular question about it, you can go, right, I need to find out about this. Bang, you can find out about it. That's the plan. So the volunteers are transcribing the accident reports for us. In some cases, complete transcriptions. In other cases, kind of giving us a good summary of the key details, because some of them are really quite long, certainly for transcription purposes. And again, once again, this would not be possible without the wonderful volunteers who've been doing the hard work on this. It's, as I say, 80,000 individuals who had accidents, a tiny fraction of the whole, because not all accidents were investigated. Again, a real contrast to today. And forget near misses. That's no one's interested in near misses for unfortunately much of the period up to well into the 20th century, if not the 21st at times. I'm glad that things have changed on that one. What I'm really kind of interested in this one, in that it gives us a way into seeing a bit more about working practices in the past, to understanding what's happened, what's changed, hopefully, and thinking about some of the issues it raises about who was responsible for accidents, say, which is a really, really interesting one, and how that's changed. Again, I'm quite glad to see there's been quite a lot of change in that over the past 15 or 20 years or so, give or take.
It really is. It's a fascinating transect. And yeah, it's a fascinating proxy for lots of social issues, not even just within the railway. Like, it's just a huge amount that can be pulled out of it. So making it accessible. So yeah, I echo that. All the people who got involved in Transcription Tuesday and all the other sort of events that you run to have people sort of volunteering en masse. Thanks to all those volunteers who got involved. Because the data, having the data and the data being accessible are two very separate. Having the data trapped in whatever scanned documents it happens to be,
Exactly. So it's endlessly fascinating, I find, for all sorts of reasons you've mentioned that we've discussed already. I think one of the kind of key questions, if I can put a question to both you, Gareth, and the audience, which is, particularly if you hadn't heard of this project before, where should we be spreading the word? I have to say the railway side of things is one that I kind of neglected a bit, because I kind of thought, well, I come from certainly as a historian from the railway history background, and that's fine. It's kind of like home turf. I want to take it to people who wouldn't necessarily think of it, like the family historians, the local historians, and try and work within the industry. Although again, that's something where I could definitely do with some advice on. But yeah, if anyone's got any suggestions about where we should promote it, how we should do that to make people more aware of it, all the resources are free. So we want people to use it. That's going to give the most back to the volunteers who've been involved in transcription, but also again as a means of kind of marking those who are named in it as well, and kind of recognising what they've been through. Yeah,
it's I mean, my gut instinct, I think possibly they're already involved as an organisation, but it would be the kind of the people who study safety as a science rather than a history, and kind of potentially look at modelling the way that interventions alter outcomes. So the Railway Safety and Standards Board would be the organisation within the industry, that my gut instinct. But I think, are they not already actually interested in the project or engaging with it?
So, Greg Morse.
Greg, okay, yeah.
So, and he's been really supportive from the outset, and again, an endless source of advice and support there. So, a big thanks to him as a name check, and because it falls partly within his role to think a bit about the learning from the past side of things. So, yeah, we've had some contacts in, and again, the ORR have been very helpful to us. Again, just like they have with the Railways Archive, they lent us some of the volumes of records that we could then scan and make available for transcription, and hopefully we will be able to make those available publicly in due course. So it's just a question of kind of trying to work out what the best tack is, what's going to be most useful for people in the industry now. On that front, and again, I come at this as an academic. I'm not in the industry. I don't have that practical experience, so I don't know what's going to be most useful. So actually, kind of talking with you all is really helpful for me on that front, and for the project as a whole.
Yeah, there's definitely. We should definitely have a long chat outside of this forum, a kind of a longer, deeper chat where time isn't kind of screaming at us, because it would be really interesting to unpick. The thing that jumps into my head is looking at how safety, so understanding historical safety interventions, so some of the things that we know were being done to improve safety, and then looking at the data and seeing how they had an impact, and then using that to potentially model the impact of changes that might happen now, and what we might expect to see as an impact on safety now, and what those numbers might look like. Obviously, there are lots and lots of variables at play. But that could be interesting. It could be, so if a particular decision was made about even like management structure or oversight or things like that, and how that cascaded down to a safety. So management changes, how those manifested in terms of safety. That's interesting, because it's the sort of thing that's interesting. It's interesting for the unions to understand what the employment structure change, structural changes, management changes are. But also, if we're approaching a period when the railway is going to change again in terms of who's in charge or what the structure is, that has always had a negative impact on safety. Nationalisation did not reflect well in terms of safety in the immediate aftermath, and privatisation certainly didn't. In the immediate aftermath of massive structural change, unfortunately, the important stuff ends up slipping through the cracks with safety. So for me, it's interesting to look, right, we've got this data set. What management changes happened? How did that then result in safety changes? Can we build up a case against, or what can we learn from that to minimise those impacts?
Well, that's great. That's really interesting. Again, thinking about it. So one of the data sets that we got behind the scenes that we're cleaning and trying to get as accurate as possible before we make it public covers the interwar period. So we get grouping coming out. So absolutely. I really wonder what will come out of that. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, so that'll definitely be really interesting to see whether indeed that manifested in safety slipping through the cracks, or if it maybe resulted in positive change. That'll be really interesting to look at. We can run on a little bit tonight. I don't mind that. It's more your time that I'm worried about. Shall we?
Yeah, let's move on.
Let's do it. Yeah. So, oh crikey! So here is a sketched image. Railwayman's sad death near Edinburgh, with a very rapidly sketched image, and someone what appears to be. They look a bit like, because of the style of animation, they kind of look like they're wearing a frock. But anyway, they're collapsing in front of a train, and it looks all quite tragic, and everyone's quite. There's a chap in the background with his hand on his hat. Everyone looks kind of quite concerned. Tell us about this image.
So I wanted to include this one, but partly because your description is absolutely brilliant, and again, it's because it's flagged up something I hadn't really spotted before in this, because I know the context, and I didn't give you that context. And this could be a passenger, a female passenger, who's fallen in front of an oncoming express, and we've got a railwayman who's dashing out to save her. And as it says, the title, it talks about the railwayman, or the caption for the image. However, what we've got is two railway workers. We've got Robert Watt, foreman carriage cleaner, and carriage cleaner Wilhelmina Gardner. So the woman is a railway employee, and both end up being killed in this incident, which took place on the 9th of July 1913 at, again, I'm probably going to mispronounce this one, Surbiton station.
That sounds about right to me.
Okay, great stuff. So what's now a suburb of Edinburgh, on the North British Railway at the time. And they were at work cleaning carriages, and they were waiting for an express to pass. And the accident report says, unaccountably, Gardner turned back and stepped onto the connection about 5 yards in front of the engine. Watt turned back and endeavoured to pull Mrs. Gardner clear of the connection, but both of them were struck by the engine and sustained fatal injuries. This image, it should be said, it comes from the Illustrated Police News, which was a rather lurid publication in the sense of, why go for a kind of slightly more tasteful image, or difficult with something like this, admittedly, but why do that when you can kind of really get a dramatic, sensationalized image out of it? So they were well known for that. But it's the only image, in inverted commas, of the incident that I've found, and certainly I think it's at least fit for consumption in that sense. So it kind of, again, it's a useful reminder there about what's going on, about who's involved in working on the railways, and what happens. The thinking is that they were trying to cross the lines to get to a mess room, which was on the other side of the tracks, and afterwards the company did install a mess room on both sides of the tracks, so to prevent people going across the lines. What's interesting, and I always find, again, the press reporting of this, is it talks all about Robert Watt and about how heroic he was. No doubt he was, but it barely mentions Mrs. Wilhelmina Gardner, and in some of the reports they get her name completely wrong, which we don't know anything about her. We know a little bit more about Watt, and that the Carnegie Hero Fund provided some extra money for his wife and 4 children who were left as dependents above the statutory compensation. So it's just, again, this reminder about thinking about the individuals involved and the people that we get these details from, the data, the reports that are in the project data set. If we could go on to the next one.
Yeah, sure.
Again, I was quite conscious of just thinking a bit about trying to think about making people visible. And what's quite nice about some of the data that we get out of the project is that we get quite a long run. Now, Robert Stanbury's case is really interesting because he first appears in the accident records in 1911, 17th of August 1911. when he is involved in an accident to fireman Price Harris at, again, I've chosen all the wrong names for this. I'm going to say Pont Dolgoch.
Yeah, Pont Dolgoch. Yeah, it's got a Torbach, so it's a slightly long O. Yeah.
Perfect,
You're right.
thank you.
Pont Dolgoch. Yeah.
On the Cambrian Railway, so not very far away from Abermule by chance, although on a different stretch of the line. Single track line, token system in operation. One evening he is going to exchange a token with a train that's passing through, but he's only got one arm, so he can't hold a light and exchange the token. So he rigs up a stool, pops the lamp on the stool so that the fireman can see for the exchange of the token. Unfortunately, he gets the stool slightly too close to the edge of the platform, and the fireman bumps his arm on it. It's obviously a very minor injury because it doesn't say anything more about what the nature of the injury was, just that he'd bumped his arm. So thankfully nothing serious. But what's great about it, we've got a disabled railwayman who's found a workaround and is still at work. He's a station master for here. It's again quite interesting. It doesn't tell us anything about how Stanbury lost his arm, and one of we know about that because one of the nice things about the project work is that we put up a blog post about Robert Stanbury saying it'd be really interesting to know how he lost his arm, but we don't know about it. What's going on. And someone who read this, Derek Savage, got in touch to say, "Oh right, I've got an interesting crossover with my family history, and here you go. I found out a bit more about him, and it was lovely. So he dug up the images via the people mentioned here, and got in touch with the family. Managed to track down the family of Robert Stanbury, who kind of said, "Oh yeah, we knew about him from obviously not personally, but from the family stories that were passed down about how he didn't let the loss of the arm get in his way. He learnt to write again with his left arm in beautiful copperplate script, they said, and he was a prize-winning. He won prizes for his station gardens. So really interesting characters.
Yeah, fascinating character. Yeah.
What we do know from the other cases were coming, he had a couple of other accidents himself. After the loss of the arm that were recorded on the Cambrian, but before that he lost the arm actually in 1868 when he was employed as a porter on the Neath Brecon Railway. So we've got this really kind of long run of information about him. Again, thanks to a contributor from outside who's managed to dig up some more information and get the photo, which is really valuable. And we find out a little bit more about the nature of work, what happened, and the steps that he took as an individual to work around something that might have been meant he might not have got a job elsewhere. So it's got a really interesting insight, I think, by looking at that individual level into kind of how people lived and worked on the railways in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. There's so much. There's such a fascinating story, so much to unpick there. But yeah.
So if we go on to the next slide, again, I just think about that personal connection. Very, very brief. I wanted to include these. So these are a couple of items. One of which the Your Personal Safety booklet was from the early 1960s, issued by BR, and it's R. Eggerford has written his name on it. Now I don't know for sure, but I think that's probably this is something that I picked up along the way. I think this is probably Robert Eggerford, who was involved in an accident, injured whilst working in Swansea in the 1920s, and the dates kind of check out. So I think it probably is him. But we've got this nice kind of, I think, that tangible connection. So something that he actually held, and it kind of makes it slightly more tangible, I think. And likewise, the Iestyn Nash on this one appearing in both the image and in what we've got on the right hand side, for those not familiar, is a memorial card. So you see the black border around it, again indicating the death. He was killed at work in. Where was he killed at work? Brynaman on the Midland Railway in 1914, and he appears in the database. And this morning card came up on eBay last week, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, right, must get that, because that's what an amazing link to this man. And the image came out of the Herald of Wales and Monmouthshire Recorder, the August publication. in June 1914, courtesy of the National Library of Wales website. And if you people haven't used that resource, the National Library of Wales got a brilliant, freely available scanned copies of both English and Welsh language newspapers that relate to Wales that they hold. So really, really useful resource for us all. So again, there's all sorts of things about that tangible connection to the individuals involved in the past, and kind of actually seeing the person. I think that's really important.
And it's what's so valuable about this project. It's that, and we've alluded to it several times through this, and that's why I find the project fascinating. Is that the data is important and really valuable. And actually, we talk about statistics versus tragedies. The statistics are fascinating, are really important and interesting, and a really powerful tool in understanding not just the past but now. But also, it's the connection to those individual stories. Not just the tragedy, but the social interest of what? Tell us what was Iestyn Nash doing? What was his story? What was each of these individuals? Absolutely fascinating to kind of each of these stories, the characters, the people that we learn about, what their life was like, how familiar lots of the things they were up to were to us now, and yet how different their lives were. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, and I think that's. I'd definitely like to come back to that point about how familiar a lot of the things are in some ways. Just in a second, but one of the nice things about this is that we have had quite a lot of contact from people who said, "Oh yeah, I found my great grandfather in your database, and
really,
now we know how he lost his leg. He never spoke about it, or whatever." And likewise, we've been able to help people as well. Recently, we had a gentleman get in touch and say, "I'm trying to find out about my grandfather. We know he had a railway accident. We don't know much about it more than that." And we started to dig around, and although we don't have his accident in the database, through a kind of process of elimination, applying a little bit of knowledge, and by asking people for help, often via the wonderful medium of Twitter. Twitter is a great place at times. We've got some responses. We've been able to find out a little bit more about him, because people out there are interested and really generous with their time, and that's been really heartening, particularly given all of the difficulties over the last year or so, and the challenges that everyone's faced. The generosity that people show about a topic that could be seen as kind of very discomforting and unprepossessing. People are really interested in it and trying to think about it, which I think is great.
I mean, the railways were one of Britain's largest employer. If you kind of forget the different companies, you think of the railway as one thing. Yeah. They've been Britain's largest employer for a very, very long time, which means that that's a lot of social history, a lot of genealogy, a lot of individual history within a data set like this. That's a huge amount of individual stories. There are very few people in this country who don't have some historical connection to the railways, because the railways, at their peak, 650,000 people employed. The best part of 1 million people employed. And if you kind of look at some, kind of spread those wings a little bit. Yeah, absolutely incredible. Just huge numbers of people who are involved in some way. So it's, as a data set, it's going to be a useful resource for people interested about their family history.
Yeah, completely.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
So what I'm going to do is press this button, and I think something changed. So you're going to be small, and I'm going to have to resize you again because Skype changed it again. But
make me bigger.
There we are. I've made you bigger. There we go. Mike, we've got you back. Got us side by side. We've run on by 10 minutes, but as long as you don't mind, it'd be nice to pick up on some of the thoughts people have, any questions, and kind of open the discussion up a bit. Thanks for the slides. Fantastic. Really interesting kind of bits and pieces and sort of rounding it out. But people in the chat, any questions? Mike, if you've got any thoughts and sort of, I suppose I've kind of been asking you questions as we've gone through, so I don't have so much. But anyway, so
I suppose my question, and this is tricky. This is a question as much for me as anybody else, and the project as anybody else, is thinking a bit about what use can we make of this within the industry today and this material, because we're only going up to 1939. The shape of the industry is so radically different and has changed so much. And this has been some of the discussions that I've had with people, including at the RSSB. A bit about is it too different to be useful, or is there still material in here that could help? And one of the things I think is really interesting, and it came out particularly publicly, I think, after the the Margam incident, when Gareth Delbridge and Michael Lewis lost their lives. I was going to say last year, I think it's 2019 actually.
19, I think, yeah.
Yeah. And people, what was reported often in the press then was, obviously Network Rail was criticised, and rightly so. But the kind of one of the things that seized on was this, they're using Victorian methods in terms of protecting staff work on the tracks, and actually there is that is the case in some respects,
and
so that's one where I think the project might have a bit of purchase in some respects, in that those cases are all right. The motive power is different, but essentially what's going on in terms of the working under live conditions. Again, lots more of it happening in our period, and before 1939. But still, it's there are similarities there. So I wonder if that may be one area. But again, I'm very interested in what people have to say and suggestions about that.
Yeah, there's I mean, there are a few comments in the chat that are pinging up. I don't know to what extent you're able to see those. Maybe I said one thing you can do is flick through once this is saved, all the chat's saved. So if you're interested, you can kind of come and flick back through the comments if you're interested. There's a few things, people pointing out ideas for how you can reach out the project. Two things I have to kind of to respond to what you said there. The second is going to be answering Matt Reed's question about green and red zone working, because it's relevant to what you're describing, and I'll explain what those terms mean as well. The first is another thing I thought of in terms of the usefulness of this data set. One of the things that we are doing better in the rail industry is risk management and numerical, so quantitative rather than qualitative risk management. But one of the challenges we have is that in thinking, so in a sense, that's trying to think of all the possible things that could go wrong and then accounting for them. Most of them drop away very quickly by our working practices or by our, for me as a designer, I'm trying to design out all these things before any worker gets anywhere near the railway. Yeah. One of the challenges we have is in a railway that is safer, where there are fewer incidents, we are perhaps risking forgetting some of the things that we've eradicated to the point where we might come full circle and they might start happening again. So a genuine thing for me that's useful is, and it's something that I dare say you've got in your data set, is listing off all the different types of incident, and then in some way representing that as understanding what those are, what the risks are, and what potentially leads to some of those, and actually building those into current risk models to make sure that as a designer I know all. So it not necessarily every single individual, but grouping these into kind of fairly obvious categories that I dare say will parallel what the issues are now, and ensuring that those are caught at a design and then at a kind of safety management, kind of staff management level as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting, because some of that we've tried to do from the outset certainly in terms of grouping particular cases together, so that we can say, we can fairly easily sort and look at the data in terms of the location, if it's track related. So it gets a little bit more complicated after that, because we then get the kind of qualitative, the reports side of things, where we've tried to reproduce as much of the written report as possible, rather than kind of breaking it down into easily categorizable chunks, as it were. So that would require a little bit of work to go through, quite a lot of work to go through, and kind of pull out some stuff. But that would certainly be possible, and that's a really useful pointer there. Thank you.
So that's just another thing that pinged is that it's something. So for example, in the common safety method, which is our main tool that we use essentially trying to list out every conceivable hazard and risk, and actually having almost a crib sheet of those based on past accidents. So obviously the industry's changed, so there are lots of new ones that we have to deal with, but actually a lot of those are things potentially we've forgotten about that are worthy for us to frame and think about. So that's potentially an interesting one, and one way that could manifest would even be like just like a single document, or a sort of a brochure even of like things that used to happen that kind of don't happen anymore, but that we still need to think about. That'd be interesting. To come to Matt Reed's point about green zone, red zone. So for anyone who's listening who doesn't know what these two names mean, they often have, you hear them as open and closed line working. Generally, red zone is working under an arrangement where trains are still running. Green zone is working under an arrangement where timetabled trains are not running. It doesn't necessarily mean that all trains aren't running. You can still have engineering trains within a green zone work, kind of safe system of work, but Generally, red zone is much more dangerous. You're working under Victoria, exactly as you described, the most primitive types of protection, lookouts with a flag and things like that.
Yeah.
That's still a way we work on the railway today. Absolutely baffling. So my opinion is that red zone should be entirely eliminated. I don't see there is. Yes, it means that there are certain types of little work that people will huff and gruff and say, oh, but it's so easy to just walk out on track. And no, I don't think it is a situation where we're in the 21st century. We should have more sophisticated protection methods, and whether that means that people are working amongst trains, but there is, for example, you're making use of a modern signalling system like ETCS, where they know there are workers and therefore there is a protection. You don't need to have signal protection. There are ways to think about what that protection looks like. But traditional red zone working, where you're relying on a lookout with a flag, is just should not be happening on today's.
Okay, right. So Gareth, I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because it staggers me again, partly because of the sheer number of cases that we see in the data, and again we're coming up to what will be the centenary, and I'm going to try and do some work with. I haven't approached them yet, so I probably shouldn't say it publicly. I don't know, but with Network Rail and others about this. But Stapleton Road in Bristol, there was a particularly bad incident in September 1921 where a Great Western train ran into a gang of 7 plate layers, 5 of whom were killed, 1 of whom injured. Only 1 walked away unscathed. Quite unusual for so many to be killed in one go. So it made the press for once because of the numbers involved.
Yeah.
I'm really keen to do something along the lines, it can be done. It's done for Abermule, which I know is a different scale and different set of circumstances and so on. But I'm keen to do something to say, well, actually, look, we could perhaps mark this in some way, a plaque or something, whatever, an event. I'd like to be in contact with the families of those, the descendants of those who were involved. And see what we can do and use it in that respect, both as a marker, but also a symbolic gesture, perhaps, to say, well, look, this, there are loads and loads, so many people who've been adversely affected by working on the railways, and there's nothing really done to mark that. This could be a nice isn't the right word, but a good way of doing that and getting a bit of traction on it, and using it again within the industry as a learning tool. So, well, okay, what did go wrong? How did this happen? Because, as you say, that red zone working was the issue, and for much of our period is the norm. And the provision of lookouts, it always staggers me that across, certainly before 1939, the provision of lookouts was in most cases it was advisory, in the sense of the gang could choose whether or not to appoint one of their number to act as a lookout. Well, this is the whole thing about the accident investigations that were undertaken at the time, which underpin quite a lot of the project data. They tell us what the investigators thought was going on, and the investigators come to a particular conclusion, which is generally, oh, well, the workers were careless. Well, no, it's not that at all. Again, this wouldn't happen now. I'm really pleased to say, 'cause again, the conversation I've had with Network Rail have been very interesting on this and about the fair culture approach. Where looking at the workers and behavioural sides of things is kind of the last thing that I'll turn to. Back in our period, it's really the first thing they turn to because it's a default. And in those cases, it's you miss the fact that workers take perfectly reasonable decisions under the circumstances. If you're in a PW gang and you've got 7 men to do the work, and you've got a set amount of time in which you've got to do it, and the company expects you to, and you'll be in trouble if you don't do it, why would you take a man off the job to act as a lookout? And it's going to slow you down by not having the manpower, because it was all men at this time, and get in trouble with the company. You're guaranteed trouble, whereas you might be all right without a lookout. It's just, again, the lack of lookouts always staggers me in the past.
And the fact that we're still, for people thinking, oh, surely we don't have people communicating with, a vuvuzela, a whistle, or a flag. This document is slightly out of date. This is the 2013 document. I don't know if it's actually been updated yet. It might still not have been. Anyone who's done their PTS recently, tell me in the chat. This is RT3170, and I can't quite see my own. There is.
Perfect. Yeah.
That's the section there. That's lookout warning. That's still an approved safe system of work on the 21st century railway.
Quite. It staggers belief.
Beyond belief. Anyway, quite a few things coming through. People saying, I've heard some people say there's nothing wrong with using lookouts. I don't agree. I'm willing to be outspoken about it. I think it's just completely it's just not acceptable. There are other tools, peewees and sort of the kind of train operated TOWs and sort of there are other options and systems available.
And people have been looking into those since at least the 1930s. I found some evidence of this systems being trialled in France and in the UK to provide audible and light warnings, that were triggered by sensors some distance out from the train arriving and so on. So, again, there are problems with that. There's no doubt about it. At the same time, people have been looking for different solutions for over 100 years. For approaching 100 years.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the comeback to that one is, well, they obviously haven't found one that works because we're still relying on lookouts. But there's an economic issue that comes into play on this one. Unfortunately,
there's an economic issue. There's the pressure, the eternal pressure of an operational railway trying to run around people maintaining it.
Yeah.
But part of that comes from, I think, we've got new tools. I'm chatting on, and we should tell me to stop and wrap up as when you want to do. We've got new tools. We've got things. I suppose the new tools I'm talking about is not so much within the industry, but we've got new tools to inform the public and to keep the public and the travelling public understanding why decisions are being made. The Network Rail Southeast Twitter account is one that I constantly just want to praise and hold up as a perfect example.
Good, aren't they?
They do threads explaining what's going on. They explain technical issues. They don't patronise the public by trying to oversimplify. They explain what the problem is in clear language. And it will have resulted in people having a better understanding and a better respect for the challenges they're facing. That needs to go not just for reactive stuff, but proactive stuff. And we're getting better. Network Rail are getting better at the proactive. Yeah. We're doing some engineering work stuff. So I want to see us being better, being more comfortable with interrupting the public for short bursts, but it being protected working. I don't think there's a sphere for unprotected working anymore.
This is a thing that always gets me. So some of my other work has looked at about real hornet's nest. I don't want to kick too much about how health and safety is perceived. I've done some work on this with a colleague from the 1960s through to the present, and health and safety gone mad and all the rest of it. At the same time, when you boil it down to the fundamentals behind this is anybody really going to disagree with the idea that people should be coming home from work safe and healthy? Surely no one in their right mind would disagree with that. And then you kind of work out the implications of that. Well, if that's the aim, then what does it take to get there? And if that then means there's going to be a little bit of inconvenience for the travelling public or for freight services or what have you, then again, with good explanation as to why, saying, well, look, by doing this, we are saving these lives or we are helping protect these people.
Yeah.
That, I think, would carry a lot of weight.
Yeah, and it comes to bigger, and ultimately, as with all these things, these are nebulous subjects that interact, that lots of different things intersecting. This is why, as engineers, we like to build a railway that doesn't require any maintenance. This is why, so whenever people talk about gold plating, I don't like that phrase because it usually masks someone having a lack of understanding and wanting to pull down capital costs for no reason. The reason that we often front load costs of projects is because we don't want to have people on track in the first place. We're trying to design it in such a way that you don't require anything other than perhaps automated maintenance anyway. So it comes back to lots of things in terms of safety is that broader picture. Anyway, I've digressed substantially. So lots of interesting things coming up lots of different things like should a train be the lookout, park a train to protect the track in front of it. Very interesting point, David Shepherd. Network Rail have trialled that sort of thing. And it partly comes down to resources of you have to have a driver in place, which is adding cost. One of the options was there was a train that was a bit of a disaster actually, and it was sat in Darlington for absolutely ages because I think all of its wheels were flat, but it's a train that essentially has skirts that open out and it parks, and by parking obviously it's signal protected, and then skirts come out, drop down, and you've got everything's undercover, nicely lit. You've got a crane so you can do work. That's a clever idea, but people were like, it was a bit of a faff, and I'll just put some people out red zone working again and it's fine. So there's just that bit of a disconnect of that momentum of like, well, basically it's fine, so we'll stick with what we know, rather than making use of what is actually quite a clever idea.
I think this comes back down to that attitude of and we're all guilty of this at times, I feel. It's like, well, it won't happen to me. It'll be all right. It's been fine in the past, and I'm not going to say what are the chances because that is possible to calculate, broadly speaking.
Yeah, yes.
But I think then people take that kind of perhaps that attitude at all levels. probably.
And I think that's why, and that's where this project is interesting, because it's not just it was back in the old black and white times, and so everything was unsafe and blah and blah. The work that you've done as part of the WLD project is showing that there were efforts to minimise worker casualties, showing that there were processes to educate staff, showing that there was that actually there was an understanding of the fact that this was not normal. There was still an understanding at the time that there were all these tragedies going on. It wasn't the case that this was it was just something that happened. And actually, we can learn from that now, because some of the attitudes that you'll see then are the same attitudes as you have now. So there's a lot to there's a definite kind of feedback loop of us of the project and us being informed, it both on a data level but also in the broader sort of social context as well. Mike, that's been absolutely brilliant. I've enjoyed that tremendously. We're 25 minutes late. That's
sorry.
Fine.
Yep.
Right. Very quickly, I will do my closing bits and pieces as oft I do. In audio only mode. Hopefully this has been okay for everyone. Thanks for listening in audio only. We are available on all podcasting platforms, I think, mostly. Next thing is my normal adverts of Patreon, Discord, and PayPal. I'm not even going to, you know where those are, everyone. Do that if it so pleases you. In the Discord, many things happening, particularly if you're a Patreon person. Pay attention to the Discord. I need your answers. I've got two plugs from me before we go back to Mike. Plug number one, if you haven't already watched Tim's latest The Architecture the Railways Built, it was brilliant. This Lisbon station, it was absolutely stunning. And we went to Benelli Viaduct and we went to Sheffield. It was great fun. And then obviously watch it next week too. Next advert thing is, and you've done this course, Mike, so you're familiar with this course, right?
Well, yeah, I did it in the pre-David days.
Oh my goodness, such things exist?
Yeah, quite.
The master's degree in railway studies. Apply now if you're interested in that sort of thing. In fact, I know there are several people who've done this course in the chat now. Barry, where are you? You were in there a minute ago.
Barry's here, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, I bet you know Barry. Yeah. Anyway,
yes.
So yes. So this is. I'll just look at it. Is this York? I think it might be York.
Yes.
It
is
York.
It is.
There's the Minster in the background,
Yeah.
and those lovely double slips going on. Anyway, I digress. Yes, look into that. Fantastic course. The only reason I've not done it is because I've not found the time. But I will definitely be a person who does this course at some point in the future. Lots of cool people from the industry are involved in it. David Horn did some talks within last year's or the year before. Just lots of cool people get involved. Anyway, it's brilliant. Next, go on.
Can I'll just chip in on this one. I can say very happily on this one because I'm the external examiner for the course. So it's fascinating. I mean, I'm going to be interested in it anyway, but. There's really, really interesting work that the students produce, particularly when it gets to dissertations. And it's always I've read a batch of it recently, and I've got a batch that's just come in to read. And it's interesting topics that David's put together on the taught side of it. And then when it gets to the research side of it, there's always interesting stuff that comes up. So, it's a well constructed, well taught course, and it just produces some fascinating material.
Yeah, I think presumably it would have been last year, or Dr. David Turner used the Advanced Passenger Train Rail Natter as a question, as part of an essay question, I think, because I did a counterfactual and it kind of, and I tried to unpick some of the assumed things. I tried to unpick the idea that there'd be some radical change and that everything basically there's a bigger picture than the railways in terms of what changes people's travelling patterns, etc., and he used it as a subject. So I don't know whether that makes people interested or put off. In any case, I just put that out there. Go and get involved. Right, so next thing. Oh yeah, of course, the tease for before we come back to Mike, the tease for next week's Rail Natter. It's the 1 year anniversary special Rail Natter. We've been doing this. Yours is the last of the episode 51, which is the 52nd episode. This is the 1 year anniversary. Technically, this is the 1 year anniversary that we've just done, but I put the 52 as the 1 year anniversary because it means that we've definitely covered an entire year date wise. A year of these. Good grief. So there's going to be all sorts going on for this. There's going to be the longest episodes, the most popular episodes, all the stats that you could possibly imagine are going to be in there. Plus, all the Patreon people are going to be in a Zoom chat in a large group, possibly, if the technology works, no, they definitely will be, clapping and cheering, and it'll be like an episode of Ramesh Ranganathan's Ranganation. So everything will be absolutely fine. The technology will hold up perfectly. And, more importantly, I'm just reaching behind myself.
Yeah, that sounded dramatic.
It was very dramatic. I'm good at doing the audio. I'm getting good at immersive podcasting. Actually, I've done a couple of podcasts recently, and I've got good at making the audio represent my movement around the room. Right, go back side by side. Hi, Mike again. Two things. The first is my gold can of paint, which is spraying up a special virtual prize that people will receive for whatever in the next episode. I know, right? And the other thing is also thanks to Masquette for my regional railways mask, which I've just arrived in the post as well. Loving that.
Very nice.
Right, that was a lot of adverts. Mike, tell us what you need to plug. It's time.
Well, thank you. Really, we've already done it. It was having this conversation. It was seeing what people who are out there listening, watching, were saying and thinking. And I will check the chat after. And telling people about the project. So, people do please go and visit the project website, engage with us on Twitter, want to hear from you. And, we're always interested. We do try and be as collaborative as possible. We want people to know about us. We want people to use the materials that we're producing. And that's going to be the thing that's going to do us the best.
I think people pointed out a lot in the feed, but the Twitter account is brilliant, and lots of people engage with that, and lots of really interesting conversations happen. Right. Some of the things that you post or get involved in discussions with, whether it's Dr. DT or others posting things, and then discussions happening underneath. I love that. It's really good. Mike, it only remains for me to say what an absolute pleasure it's been to have you on, and absolutely we'll have you back on with lots of pictures of. We'll talk about training materials for track safety. That's the next chat.
Awesome.
It'll be a really interesting one. Yes, can only... thanks so much, Mike. Take good care of yourself. And, Cheerio, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheerio.